The impact of insecticides on pollinators, and bees in particular, is the subject of ongoing scientific, public and political debate. At the heart of this debate is a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids. Since December 2013, the use of 3 neonicotinoids has been suspended throughout the European Union. The suspension followed the publication of 3 risk assessments, one for each substance, carried out by the European Food Safety Agency, EFSA. Although this measure has been adopted across the European Union, there is not a consensus about the dangers of neonicotinoids to bees among EU member states, and some countries, such as the United Kingdom, have conducted their own risk assessments and believe that use of these substances does not normally pose a risk to bees. Unsurprisingly, the neonicotinoid manufacturers also argue that these products are not harmful to bees when used correctly. In April 2014, the Association of Applied Biologists organised a conference entitled Pollinators in Agriculture, and the first session of the conference was devoted to the debate surrounding the impact of neonicotinoids on pollinators. 3 speakers from EFSA, industry and academia were invited to present their viewpoints. In this video, I hope to capture the key arguments of the debate. So, why should we be concerned about the fate of pollinators? This slide shows the value of pollinator services and, despite the many question marks, it is clear that pollinators provide important services to society, both in terms of food production and amenity benefits. Additionally, they also provide benefits associated with biodiversity and ecosystems. So, here's what the invited speakers had to say.
So, good morning everybody, and thank you for inviting me for giving this presentation. And I will talk particularly on the work EFSA is undertaking last 2012-2013 on the neonicotinoids risk assessment revision on bees. Neonicotinoids are insecticides highly toxic to bees. As you can see, the oral lethal dose is on the range of few nanograms per bees for imidacloprid, ametoxam and clothianidin, while thiacloprid and acetamiprid are a little bit less toxic. I mentioned those substances because they are the only one approved in Europe so far. They were approved in Europe as a substance in between 2006-2009, but the plant protection product appeared on the market since 1991. There were these last years, and those years there were a lot of research on these insecticides, and quite often the research end up with diverging view among scientists on the risk. So the data were evaluated according to 2 key elements. The first element was the exposure, and the second element was the interpretation of results. For the exposure, we had to look at whether the exposure was proof in the studies, where the exposure was representative of worst case conditions, and whether there was a survey of crop or other flowering plants in the surrounding 4 kilometers of the experimental area. Regarding the interpretation of the results, we look at the presence of statistics, whether the data were analyzed from a statistical point of view. So those 2 elements were the key driver for the study evaluation. As I said, the route of exposure considered were the dust during the sowing, the residues in nectar and pollen, and the residues in glutation fluid. And we didn't consider the residues in succeeding crop plants and residues in insect honeydew, which for such kind of substances which are systemic and persistent may have or may be an important route of exposure. As I said, we have adopted stepwise a tiered approach for the risk assessment, which is characterized by an increased complexity of the assumption towards more realistic conditions. So we perform screening steps and several low tiers called tier 1 and tier 2, and then we also try to consider the higher tier studies for higher tier assessment. And we look at the acute, chronic, and the risk to be broadened some, when possible, to sublethal effects. Regarding the exposure via dust, we had to consider default deposition values for dust drift. These deposition values were from a draft guidance document, and they were based on experimental field with pneumatic driller machine, including deflectors. We had considered both two kinds of adults, both foragers and nurse bees. The foragers were considered only exposed to nectar, while the nurse bees are considered to be exposed to both nectar and pollen. So we calculate these residues intakes, and we compare these residues intakes with the toxicological endpoints. And we consider how much of this guttation fluid a bee has to take to achieve the LD50. And then we compare this with the potential, the water that, estimated water that a bee can carry in a day in a crop. And as the toxicity values are very low, the amount of guttation fluid needed to achieve the LD50 were very low in comparison to the water a bee can carry over. So this is was a clear indication of some concern. So in conclusion, we could, regarding the exposure from pollen and nectar, we consider a low risk, presenting a low risk only the uses on crop not attractive to honeybees. Regarding the exposure from dust, the risk was indicated high or could not be excluded, except for sugar beet and for glasshouse uses, or for some granular formulation. And for the exposure from guttation, the only risk assessment completed was for thiametoxam, while for the field studies available, that was based on our field studies, while the other field studies were considered to have uncertainty to conclude, and therefore was considered an issue that could not be finalized. So for many of the authorized uses, we didn't have enough data available, or the data were not sufficient, as I already said, and so no enough information on dust release, or no data on concentration in nectar and pollen, or no data on the guttation frequency and on the relevance of this guttation fluid as a relevant route of exposure. And we list all these data gaps in our conclusions, and also we acknowledge all the uncertainties around the evaluation. So as I said, the conclusions were adopted by HEPSA in December, but then were published on the website in January. The free conclusion for the free neonicotinoids, the conclusion on fipronil was published later on. So a detailed, much more details are available on those documents, which are published available in an EFSA website.
Yeah, I would like to give you an industry perspective about the topics related to bees and neonicotinoids. As we know, as it's generally accepted, bee health is influenced by a couple of various multiple factors. It's about nutrition, it's about genetic factors, of course, it's also about pesticides, parasites and diseases, especially the latter ones. And this is nicely reflected by recent surveys that have been published by the European Reference Lab for Bee Health. Here we see in this survey among European beekeepers, the top two were diseases, especially the varroa mite. Pesticides are rather on the, well, not so prominent places. A similar picture you get when the European laboratories on member state level were surveys, likewise diseases, especially varroa, rather than pesticides. There are one group of compounds which has here a nitro group. Those are more toxic, like imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, clothianidin, and some which have instead a cyano group, like acetamiprid and thiacloprid, which have a, by order of magnitude, lower bee toxicity. The reason is that those cyano-substituted compounds can be very, very quickly be degraded by the enzymatic system of the bees. The potential risk of these residues is normally addressed in the first place with higher tier studies. That means with studies which are considering the realistic exposure scenarios, like tunnel trials, like field trials. So for imidacloprid, clothianidin, and likewise for thiamethoxam, plenty of those studies have been conducted, some dozens in total, so it's really a kind of very well-studied chemistry in comparison with other classes of chemicals. And those studies were complemented, of course, by residue studies to establish the relevant residue levels in the matrices of interest. I give you a few examples of some of those studies that have been conducted. One, for instance, with clothianidin, is a multi-site field study that was conducted over 3 consecutive years, also to cover potential chronic effects, on 4 different sites in France with seed-treated maize. And here, over those 3 years, there were control and treatment fields on all of the 4 sites. And, the colonies exposed there were monitored over all the time, including overwintering assessments, and at the same time, residue analytical samples of the pollen and of in-hive matrices of the beehives were taken. And we found no significant results between control and treatment, no adverse effects. And a very recent study I would like to introduce to you was a colony feeding study, which was also conducted over almost a whole year with various concentrations of clothianidin, where the colonies were chronically fed with this compound, and their development followed up over a longer period, including overwintering. And here again, we found the NOAC of 25 ppb and reversible effects at 50 ppb. So far for the systemic exposure. Another very important topic is the dust. This dust may get into the outlet air and kind of emit it to the environment. Of course, this is nothing that should happen. And unfortunately, it has happened in a few cases and caused then quite some damage among exposed bee colonies. So that's why, since that time, there was a very intensive work to find technical solution for this problem and to address this with improved technologies. So this is a thing that can be controlled when some key factors are taken into consideration. One of them is the seed treatment quality itself. If you have kind of intrinsically dusty seeds and treat them, then of course you treat the dust too, and you get a kind of insecticidal dust. If you have clean seeds, there is no dust sticking on the seeds that is kind of co-treated. You really see the difference. Here is a seed bag with a seed lot that was not really cleaned before the treatment, so everything red, and it looks by far better when you have a clean seed lot that goes into the treatment process. That's one thing. The other thing is the machinery that is used. As I mentioned, the problem is predominantly of interest when vacuum thermatic planters are used. The old models of them had kind of air outlet which is going like this to the top or to the side and really kind of has the potential to blow out dust where it should not be. This can be covered, this problem, by a so-called deflector, which is kind of detracting the outlet air and leading it out to the ground where it belongs actually. And this has really kind of very, very significant effect when you compare the dust deposition off-field. And you have an undeflected machine, a standard machine, and compare it with different deflector types that really can lead to a significant reduction of dust emission. So there were also conducted a lot of studies in the field to get a bit better insight into this phenomenon. So it's some pictures of such a guttation field studies here, an emerging maize field with some exposed beehives. And here, what came out of all these studies is actually, yes, guttation occurs in many crops which are cultivated, not in all in the same way. For instance, in maize, it's gutating frequently. Sugar beet is hardly gutating, or very seldom actually. Cereals, again, a bit more, but less than maize. Indeed, there are high concentrations in the guttation liquid of seed-treated plants, which are, however, decreasing quickly. But interestingly, guttation liquid did not turn out to be a kind of very relevant water source for water foraging bees. So there were very few cases where we observed bees collecting such water droplets, and even when there were such cases where obviously bees were collecting at a certain extent guttation droplets, there were individuals found with high concentrations, but never any effects on colony level. In many countries there have been this kind of multifactorial monitorings to see what kind of factors are correlated with bee colony mortality, with compromised bee health and so on, measuring effects like parasites, like pesticide exposure and so on. Just as one example, the German bee monitoring, which is going on already since 10 years. And there are in many European countries such monitorings ongoing or have been conducted. And as far as I'm aware, in none of them a correlation was found between colony mortality and exposure to neonicotinoids, either in terms of in-hive residues nor in terms of exposure to treated crops.
We are not losing honeybees at the moment worldwide. They're still increasing. Since the Second World War, the stock of honeybees is increasing. So, despite what's every day in the press that the honeybee colonies are going down, it's just not true. There are some regions in the world where the honeybees are going down. The most dramatic decrease was in the Soviet Union when it fell apart. So we had a big decrease of subsidized honeybee cultivation. And also in America, the honeybees are still going down. Also, last 10 years, I think they stabilized. But what we see in addition is that it's on the right graph, is that in the same period, we need more and more pollinators because the use of pollinated crops is increasing strongly since the last 20-25 years. So the world food production is more and more dependent on pollinators. If bees are few, are they few? We talk about colony losses and CCD in America. First, what do we know about CCD? Because many people claim to me that I have to do more about CCD in the Netherlands. CCD is absent in the EU. But CCD is also absent in the USA. It was present and it was very high in 2005, 2007, maybe 2008. It was just a description of a specific syndrome, and we have had many of these occurrences already earlier. Winter losses in the Netherlands, just for an example, we had since the 2000s, we had generally losses between 15 and 20 or 25% after winter. That's far too high. Now, beekeepers say, okay, we would be satisfied if we had losses going down to 15 or maybe 10%. I think they're stupid, because the good beekeepers in the Netherlands generally have 0%. And that's of course strange. If you think about there's some environmental issue going on, why then this, and last year we had 70% of our beekeepers had 0 losses, just 0. How are they doing? They are not on specific spots, they got just mixed with all the others. We have a small group of bee research people working on mostly honeybees, a little bit on bumblebees and some solitary bees. And we do generally a rather practical, applied research to keep the beekeepers going and to help them with problems, to solve problems. And a main issue is, of course, bee health. Mm-hmm. Since Varroa came, we have done a lot of work on Varroa, and very practical, help beekeepers how to combat Varroa. But in the meantime, of course, many other subjects have become into the public debate, and neonicotinoids is one of these. So I was actually myself a little bit worried about neonicotinoids, so I started reading about that. How bad is it? And then I was a little bit less worried after reading, because I saw that the risk assessment is really done rather well, and mostly in the field the concentrations or the residue concentrations are rather low, and therefore I decided, together with Guy Smagge and Kees van Gestel from the University in Amsterdam, to write a review about it, because the confusion in the debate is very big. Some people think that really the bees are poisoned any day, and in reality, of course, they might be exposed sometimes, but in general, I think it's less nasty than some people think.
Do you think there are some issues, for example, the potential for neonicotinoids weakening the immune response of bees to viruses?
Yes, this sounds at least very plausible, but the research, what is going on at the moment, is not really conclusive about that. So I think many of the researches are also not done in a proper way, because we have already difficulty to do the research on neonicotinoids with really field reliable, field realistic concentrations. So many researchers use higher concentrations, and then of course you see effects, because neonicotinoids are insecticides. Actually. So, and the same is a little bit true with all kind of pathogens. You can infect a bee with nosema very easily. If you give 10 to the 5th spores, the bee will get sick, and then it is weakened, and then it will be more vulnerable to neonicotinoids. But that does not immediately say that really immune response is lowered or affected. So I think these studies need more sophistication.
Do you think that the current suspension of the 3 neonicotinoids is justified in Europe?
I think it's politically justified, because the people want this. So it's done by governments, but I think it's not justified in scientific base.
I also talked to a couple of delegates at the conference to get their take on the debate. Here's what they had to say. What did you think of the morning session on neonicotinoids and pollinators?
I think it was a little biased. I think there were some representative of the picture that should have been there, as for instance field experts or field representatives, like beekeepers, for instance, showing their perspective, but also administrative. And I know that the EFSA was there, they are risk assessors. Maybe what I was missing was the risk management part. Who could have so for instance, the European Commission, who could have given the administrative perspective as well. So why decisions have been done as they have done.
Do you think the decisions which have been taken, which is essentially the suspension of 3 neonicotinoids for 2 years, do you think that they're the correct decisions?
They are the normal decisions. I mean, they are the decisions that the European Commission had to take because of the safety concerns that these products have risen. So the European Commission, being the body who ensures European safety, it is the most logic thing that they did that.
And what are your personal views about the use of neonicotinoids?
Well, I think, considering that their profile, no, they are super effective, which means that they are highly toxic for pests, but also for non-target species. They are also extremely very persistent in the environment. They are hydrosoluble, which makes it that also they can be spread on the water, and then we can find them everywhere. And then they are systemic, which means that also the potential exposure of the non-target species come in contact with these products. So, considering all these properties and the use that is done of these products, that is in most of the cases prophylactic. So actually, we use them before before considering if we need them or not, just as an insurance. I think it is, like I cannot but support the Commission ban on, partial ban on these.
So you support the suspension?
I support the suspension, and I think even in the basis of all these properties, the Commission could have gone much farther in their ban.
What would you say to agronomists and farmers who say that they need these substances, and without them they have a very limited array of substances to control insect pests?
Well, I think that they have a tool that is a very effective tool, and they have not been using it wisely. So when you have a tool that you don't use it wisely, then you get problems with it. So I think they should look for other alternatives to that. And in the alternatives, it doesn't mean that you change one chemical by another one. You have to change the way you are doing things, because otherwise you are never going to get farther into your problems.
What kind of discussions at local level do you think we need to improve?
So I think that there has to be a dialogue between the main actors, and there, well, apart, of course, I'm not neglecting all the wild pollinators, but here the human actors are the beekeepers and the farmers. So either if they are livestock farmers or crop farmers, and then they all have to speak, and it is on their interest, actually, on these two sides' interest to get the best out of their relationship, because their relationships are really synergistic. The problem is that sometimes there is a third part that comes into the discussion, which is actually the pesticide industry, that is coming as well in all the discussion, but of course they also have their own interest, and sometimes all the discussions are polluted. But anyway, I think they are also actors, so they also have something to say. But I think all this dialogue needs to be done between, and I think mainly between beekeepers and farmers, because it is on their interest to get the best of their own relationship.
Why are pollinators important to farmers?
Pollinators are hugely important to farmers and growers. I mean, the most obvious reason is for pollination of their crops, to get the right kind of quality and yields from those crops. Some crops obviously more insect pollinator dependent methods. But farmers and growers, they're also custodians of the wider countryside, and they're responsible for managing a lot of that wider countryside that includes wild habitats, includes plants that also rely on pollinators. So there's this kind of double angle to really their interest. They understand how important they are for their businesses, but they also understand how important they are in terms of the ecosystem and the wider values.
We heard about the suspension of neonicotinoids. Is that an issue for your members?
The suspension of the neonicotinoids, they're a big issue. Those restrictions were brought in by the European Commission last year, and the NFU as an organisation, we lobbied against those restrictions because we didn't see that they were evidence-based, and that was a position that was supported by the UK government as well, and was supported by many other states, member states. But basically we don't see that the evidence is there to justify the restrictions that have been put in place, and I think largely the Commission's decision is very much a political one. We'd like to see work done to better understand what is happening with bees out there in the real world, what's happening with bees and pollinators that are actually foraging on treated crops, and whether or not these pesticides like the neonicotinoids are actually causing harmful population level effects out there in the real world. What's been done so far is really important work. There's a lot of studies that are lab-based and some of them are field-based, but they all rely on actually kind of priming the bees with an artificial dose of neonicotinoids, and that doesn't fully reflect the situation that happens out there naturally in the real world. And we'd like to see some large-scale experiments that do actually are based around that kind of methodology.
Did you learn anything new in the conference?
I think the conference was hugely valuable. There's lots of new things to learn in every aspect of this debate and this area of research. There's lots of little nuances and complexities. It's certainly not a simple area of science. We didn't get some of those answers to some, the big questions, because that research isn't being done, or it was certainly not ready to be reported on at the moment. But what came across is a group of scientists. We can have a very sensible debate about this issue, and together we kind of weigh the balance of evidence, and we can discuss this evidence in a very pragmatic and sensible way. And that's quite markedly different to what happens out there in the kind of the press and the media, where this whole bees issue tends to get quite sensationalised, and the public, unfortunately, as a result of that, they tend to get a very kind of skewed idea of what the science is telling us, and that's really unfortunate, because then that makes it very hard for organisations like ourselves and also for policymakers to come to decisions, because at the one side they've got what the science and the evidence is telling them, and at the other side, they've got 1 million people that have clicked onto a website based on a very limited, skewed amount of information that are trying to push them in perhaps a different direction.
And what can your members do to help pollinators?
Farmers and growers can do a lot to help pollinators, and they already are, through things like agri-environment schemes, planting pollinator nectar mixes, providing the essentials for what pollinators need. I mean, one of the things we do know about pollinators, it's almost too obvious, but one of the things we do know is that they need food and they need shelter, they need the right kind of physical habitat, and farmers can play a part in providing that. One of the really interesting bits of research that was published last year showed that over the last 20 years in Northern Europe, the declines in biodiversity of pollinators have actually slowed down. And the researchers suggest that that could be because of, over that kind of same time period, the increased conservation efforts and things like agri-environment schemes that could have contributed to that. People are a lot more aware, people are letting bits of their farms just be wild and provide habitat, provide a place for wildlife. So there's lots that farmers and growers can do. And there's also voluntary schemes that the NFU is involved in, something in the UK called Campaign for the Farmed Environment, and that is helping workshops for farmers and growers to make sure they have all the information they need if they want to put in these measures for bees, things like pollen and nectar mixes, that they understand what it's needed to actually produce something that's actually going to be a good benefit for pollinators. Because with a lot of these things, it's not a case of just throwing down some wildflower seed and letting it grow and it's going to be great for bees. It's actually, you have to treat it like a crop in itself, and it requires a certain level of management. You've got to put it in the right place, and it's got to be properly targeted. And so we're helping communicate that information so that our farmers and growers are better informed on how they can really help benefit bees and other pollinators.